I only wanted a roof, but that sealed silvering box knew my family's name.
She was 18 and broke. No room, no family, no college fund, just her father's brass polishing stick and $11 she had saved by skipping hot meals. And with that $11, she bought a forgotten daguerreotype studio in Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, a place erased from tax maps in 1911. The rear roof had folded inward. 3 window frames had rotted loose. The county had condemned it on October 3rd with demolition planned for the following spring. Inside a wooden silvering fuming box sealed beneath a false cedar floor for more than 80 years waited a portrait of Fortune and the first honest proof of who she had come from. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Ruby Bell had been polishing her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she rubbed fingerprints from spoons, rain marks from windows, and pencil dust from the margins of school books. Her father said she liked to see what remained after the cloudiness was gone. He died when she was 9, leaving 3 chemistry notebooks, a wool coat that smelled of camphor, and no explanation for why every page contained sketches of copper plates. Her mother, Marin, worked long shifts near Girard Avenue and spoke of the notebooks as if they were dangerous. She kept them in a flour tin because throwing them away felt too final. The one person who opened them was Elias Bell, Ruby's grandfather, a retired scientific instrument finisher with a left thumb flattened by decades of hammering brass collars. Every Saturday he took Ruby to his workbench above a Kensington locksmith where they warmed lampblack over a spirit flame, mixed rotten stone with oil, and polished silver-plated copper until the ceiling appeared inside it. Elias had repaired plate holders, iodine boxes, and mercury baths for photographers who distrusted paper. He taught her long figure eights, never circles, because circles left prideful marks. At noon they shared rye bread and apples by the open sash while trolley bells passed below. Then she read one page from her father's notebooks aloud. An honest surface shows every hand that touched it. Elias meant silver, but Ruby understood years later that he had also meant families, accounts, signatures, and all the small pressures people hoped darkness would conceal. Han died during a hard March rain when Ruby was 15. By the time she reached his room, the bench had been cleared. The mahogany plate vase, the chamois buffs, the spirit lamp, and his walnut box of iodine crystals were gone. Her uncle Warren said the landlord had taken them for unpaid rent. Ruby found no receipt, only a pale rectangle where the bench had stood. Warren became her guardian after Marin began disappearing for days. He never struck Ruby. He controlled rooms by lowering his voice and letting silence do the rest. He opened her mail, counted her dishwashing tips, and kept the bank book for the college fund her father had started. When Ruby asked about it, he tapped the cover with one clean fingernail and said the money was being protected from her impatience. On May 17, the bank teller looked at Ruby for too long before sliding the empty account statement across the counter. Warren had withdrawn everything in 6 transfers, then crossed the Pennsylvania line before dawn. When Ruby returned to the apartment, her suitcase sat beside the hall radiator with one broken buckle. Marin stood at the kitchen table, holding Warren's spare key between 2 fingers. She did not meet Ruby's eyes. "You cannot stay here after tonight, Ruby, please." Ruby waited for her mother to put down the key. Marin placed it in the sugar bowl instead. That small sound, brass against china, was the whole answer. Ruby took the suitcase, the flour tin of notebooks, and the polishing stick. The front door closed softly behind her. For 6 weeks she learned the geography of being unwanted. In Camden she slept beneath church reading room stairs. In Trenton she spent 2 nights upright in a bus depot until a guard recognized her coat. Back in Philadelphia she rested behind hospital laundry steam pipes, then beneath a Race Street awning where rain fell through one seam every 7 seconds. The loose money from her last wages became $9 after bread and milk, $6 after bus fare, then $3.80 after soap thread and a needle for the suitcase strap. She kept the separate $11 sewn into the lining and 1 nickel inside her shoe because Elias had said a person should reserve 1 coin for choosing not surviving. She washed in library restrooms, read her father's notebooks at long tables, and copied chemical terms onto napkins. Silver nitrate, iodine vapor, bromine acceleration, mercury development. She understood 1 sentence in 4, but the handwriting steadied when procedures became exact. On the 42nd day, sheltering from heat inside the Free Library's Parkway Central branch, she unfolded an old county bulletin used to protect a table from glue. The advertisement occupied 3 narrow lines. Abandoned photographic premises, $11. Buyer assumes liens decay and county order. Apply Philadelphia County Clerk, parcel 47B. Ruby read it twice and pressed a finger beneath the amount. Inside the lining remained a $10 bill and 2 silver half-dollars Warren had never found. By dusk, she had copied the parcel number, bus route, and clerk's hours onto a catalog card. She spent the nickel from her shoe calling the depot about the earliest bus. At 6 the next morning, Ruby boarded with the flour tin on her lap and her father's polishing stick tucked inside her coat. The road ahead ended at a studio whose windows had been dark longer than she had been alive. The bus carried Ruby northwest through neighborhoods thinning into freight yards, stone churches, and low fields silvered by morning rain. She rode 23 miles before the driver left her beside a closed feed store near the county line. From there, the directions on her catalog card required another 9 miles on foot. Her suitcase wheel broke before noon, so she tied the handle with thread and dragged it behind her until the pavement gave way to a narrow shoulder. Near dusk, rain began again. Ruby climbed into a hay barn with one missing door, buried herself beneath dry timothy, and slept while the temperature fell to 41 degrees. Mice worked somewhere inside the wall. Each time she woke, she touched the flour tin to be certain it remained beside her. By late morning, she reached the old commercial strip surrounding the clerk's office. There was Brunner's Hardware beneath a faded blue awning, Dorsey's Cafe with 6 stools visible through steamed glass, Klein Shoe Repair, Pen Lantern and Oil, and a narrow pharmacy called Alder and Son. Though only an elderly woman stood behind its counter, none looked prosperous. All were open. The county office occupied the ground floor of a soot-darkened brick building across from a trolley turnaround. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool ink and radiator dust. A brass directory pointed Ruby toward property transfers at the end of a corridor where clerks worked beneath green glass lamps. The woman behind the final desk wore her gray hair in a braided coil secured by 2 black pins. One lens of her spectacles was thicker than the other, making her left eye appear watchful even when she looked down. The nameplate before her read MRS Helen Vale, Deputy Clerk. Ruby placed the advertisement and $11 on the blotter. Mrs. Vale did not touch the money. You understand the parcel carries 12 years of unpaid assessments? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no electric service, legal water connection, or certificate of occupancy? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not compensate you for repairs? Yes, ma'am. You understand the demolition order remains unless an inspector finds measurable progress before March 1st? Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Vale studied Ruby's suitcase, the wet hem of her coat, and the flour tin held against her ribs. She opened a drawer containing a stack of deeds tied with cotton tape. Most buyers ask what happens if the roof falls. Ruby looked at the advertisement. I suppose I would learn where not to stand. The clerk's mouth tightened at one corner. It was not quite a smile, but she untied the tape. The deed was 1 page of heavy rag paper with 3 prior ownership names crossed through in red pencil. Mrs. Vale entered Ruby Bell in a careful hand, counted the bills twice, and pushed a brass stamp into a violet pad. When she struck the paper, the desk gave a short official shudder. The seal left an eagle above the date. Take Ridge Avenue north, she said. Turn left at Chaumont past the stone rail bridge and follow the lower road for 1 7/10 miles. The studio stands beyond 2 walnut trees. The number fell from the gate years ago. She began to fold the deed, then stopped at Ruby's surname. Bell. Ruby waited. Mrs. Vale removed her spectacles and polished the thick lens with the edge of her sleeve. There was an Elias Bell who came through this office every autumn, repaired the plate holders in our records room without charging us. He said warped wood made dishonest copies. Ruby's fingers closed around the polishing stick inside her coat. How was my grandfather? The clerk looked toward the corridor as though someone might still be standing there with a tool case. He asked about that studio more than once. The last time was the winter before he died. He wanted to know whether the county would sell it to a relative. I never told me. No, Mrs. Vale said. He only told me the right person would recognize what was left. She returned the spectacles to her face, took the $11, and separated one worn bill from the rest. Instead of placing it in the cash drawer, she slid it beneath the glass top of her desk. For the record, she said, although Ruby could not tell which record she meant. The deed felt too clean for Ruby's hands. She folded it along the clerk's creases, placed it inside the flour tin, and stepped back into a day brightened by wind. Ridge Avenue climbed gradually past row houses, repair garages, and walls of local schist. At Chaumont, she crossed beneath the old rail bridge while a freight train moved overhead, making rust fall in fine grains from the joints. The lower road narrowed beside wooded ground where runoff gathered in black ditches. An elderly man in a canvas apron stood beside a mailbox holding a rake. A brindled dog leaned against his knee without barking. You looking for the photographer's place? He asked. Ruby nodded. The dog sniffed the broken suitcase wheel. Name's Amos Reed. That's Sunday. He pointed with the rake toward a bend. Walnuts mark the drive. Mind the left tree. Drops limbs when the air turns. Sunday followed Ruby for 20 yards, then stopped at an invisible boundary and watched her go. The walnut trees appeared first enormous and uneven, their branches arching above a lane buried under leaves. Beyond them stood a 2-story structure of red brick and gray fieldstone, approximately 28 feet wide and 40 feet deep. The rear roof sagged around a collapsed section covered with moss. A square chimney leaned slightly east. Darkened glass occupied the upper north wall where photographers once gathered steady light, and beneath it hung a cedar sign whose remaining letters read Daguerreau Studio. The front door resisted until Ruby set down the flour tin and leaned her shoulder into it. The swollen jam released with a sound like cloth tearing. Cold iodine reached her first dry and metallic beneath the odor of mouse nests. Dust rose bitter against her tongue. Her fingers found flocked wallpaper peeling from plaster in long, damp strips. Somewhere in the rear room, water struck a metal pan with patient intervals. The front chamber held a reception counter, 2 cane chairs, and a cracked portrait frame containing only brown backing paper. Wind pressed against the dark windows, producing a low glass hum. When Ruby crossed the floor, one board answered with a clean high note and another with a dull complaint. Behind a velvet curtain stiffened by age, the working room waited under the tall north window. A mahogany camera stood upon a wheeled base, its black bellows folded inward like exhausted lungs. Ruby ran one finger along the brass lens barrel and revealed a narrow line of gold beneath the gray. The rear room had suffered most. Rain had entered through the roof and darkened the joists. A porcelain basin lay broken beside a hand pump. On a shelf stood 3 brown bottles with glass stoppers sealed by wax. She did not open them. Elias had taught her that an unlabeled bottle deserved more respect than a labeled grave. Near sunset, she found a narrow side door leading to a shallow yard. A creek moved beyond the weeds, brown from the rain and loud against flat stones. Walnut shells cracked beneath her shoes. The air tasted cleaner there, though iodine clung to her sleeves. Ruby returned inside before dark. She swept one corner of the front room with a bundle of dry twigs, spread her coat upon the least warped boards, and placed the flour tin beneath her head. Supper was half an apple and the heel of yesterday's bread. Through the wall came the creak, the dripping pan, and the faint scratch of something traveling beneath the floor. Before sleeping, she took out the brass polishing stick and held it toward the black window. It reflected nothing yet. Some places do not ask to be saved, they ask to be remembered. Ruby began with water. On the first morning, she followed the rusted pipe from the broken basin through the rear wall and found a stone-lined well beneath nettles. The rope had rotted, but the iron pulley still turned. She tied her suitcase strap to a dented bucket lowered at 31 feet and brought up water cold enough to ache in her wrists. She boiled it in a blackened kettle before drinking. The outhouse stood beyond the walnut trees, leaning but usable after she replaced one hinge with wire. By the third day, she knew the studio's language underfoot. The board beside the front counter chirped. 2 planks near the north window groaned together. A strip outside the workroom remained silent unless weight touched its far edge. She also learned that silence could have shape. Brunner's hardware smelled of linseed oil, rope fiber, and iron dust. Its owner, Mr. August Brunner, had white eyebrows so long they rested against the rims of his spectacles. He listened while Ruby named the roof chimney pump and broken door, making pencil marks on a paper sack. "How much do you have?" he asked. 38 cents. He looked at the list again. "That is not enough for the pencil." Ruby placed the deed on his counter. Mr. Brunner read the address, folded the paper sack, and wrote Ruby Bell across its front. "I can pay after I find work." "You already found work." He opened a ledger thick with fingerprints. $10 credit. Saturdays you sweep here until it's settled. "I cannot promise how long that will take. Neither can the roof." I gave her a narrow booklet titled Repairs for Farmhouse and Shop, published in 1937 with a cracked green cover. Inside were chapters on masonry, framing, glazing, and stove draft. On the first page he wrote, "Return when the house teaches you a better way." Ruby bought a wire chimney brush for $1.20, a half-pound coil of baling wire for 18 cents, 2 cotton work rags for 12 cents, a tin of stove blacking for 35 cents, and a used hand scraper for 40 cents. Mr. Brunner entered each price without rounding. The chimney came first because the nights were cooling. Ruby spread an old curtain across the hearth, tied the brush to the well rope, and climbed the interior ladder to the attic. The roof opening let in enough light to show the chimney throat narrowing beneath the cap. She lowered the brush from above, twisting clockwise so the bristles would not unscrew from the fitting, then drew it up in short strokes. The first pass released soot. The second released creosote in hard black scales that struck the curtain like thrown buttons. One piece was nearly the size of her palm and shone at the broken edge. She worked for 5 hours, stopping whenever the rope burned through her gloves, then scraped the smoke shelf with a spoon-shaped iron tool found behind the grate. At dusk, she held a mirror beneath the flue and saw a clean square of sky. She built the first fire from walnut twigs, 3 split boards taken from a collapsed crate, and 1 tightly twisted sheet of county notices. Smoke hesitated beneath the lintel, curled once into the room, then lifted. Ruby fed the flame carefully. Heat reached the brick, then the floor, then her face. Her first hot meal in the studio was oats boiled with half an apple and a pinch of salt. She ate from the kettle beside the hearth while the stove blacking dried on the iron grate. The food was plain, but steam rose past her eyes, and for the first time in 6 weeks she finished eating before looking for a safer place to sleep. The next morning she began examining the workroom. She found 7 objects worth keeping where they stood: the mahogany camera with its rack and pinion focusing rail, a brass lens stamped C.C. Harrison, 2 velvet head braces, a plate polishing vise bolted to the bench, a shallow mercury developing box with a cracked thermometer, a ruby glass safe light, and the wooden fuming box beneath the north window. The fuming box was waist-high, built of cedar, darkened almost black at the corners. Its sliding lid carried two circular apertures where iodine and bromine trays had once rested. Purple staining marked the interior rails. Ruby did not touch the residue with bare hands. She cleaned around it instead. Under the bench lay dry leaves, mouse husks, strips of wool backing, and a broken plate holder. As she swept, the broom struck the side of the fuming box and produced a hollow wooden answer. Ruby struck it again with one knuckle. The upper wall sounded dense. The lower wall did not. She removed the empty trays, wiped the box with a damp rag, and tested each panel. The cedar floor appeared solid, secured by 6 square nails, dark with age. Yet when she tilted the box toward herself, something shifted inside with a heavy, delayed slide. Ruby set it upright and fetched the hand scraper. She pressed beneath the floor's front edge. Nothing moved. She examined the nail heads through her father's small magnifying glass and noticed that 2 bore no hammer marks. They were not nails at all, but cedar plugs rubbed with lamp black. Using the point of the polishing stick, she lifted the first disc. Beneath it waited a slotted brass screw. The second concealed another. The false floor rose 1/4 inch after 3 turns. Ruby stopped. She opened both windows, tied a damp cloth across her mouth, and carried the fuming box nearer the front door. Old iodine crystals could burn skin and lungs. Elias had written that warning twice in the notebooks. The cedar panel came free with a soft suction. Beneath it was a compartment no deeper than 4 inches, lined with green baize and divided into 3 fitted spaces. The first held a parcel wrapped in chamois. The second contained 12 silver-plated copper sheets separated by tissue. In the third sat a tin document box with a narrow clasp. Ruby lifted the chamois parcel first. Inside lay Elias's walnut iodine box, his agate burnisher, 2 polishing paddles, and the mahogany plate vise she had last seen above the Kensington locksmith. His initials had been cut beneath the vise jaw, EB, small and exact. Ruby placed both palms on the bench. For several minutes she did not open anything else. The copper sheets came next. Each plate was 6 1/2 by 8 1/2 inches, the silver surfaces protected by paper gone yellow at the edges. Beneath the final plate lay a daguerreotype in a pressed leather case. Ruby released the tiny brass hook. A man and woman looked back from the mirrored plate. Their faces appeared only when she angled the case away from the window, emerging from silver darkness, as if the room itself had learned to remember. The woman had Ruby's narrow jaw. The man wore Elias's flattened left thumb across one knee. A folded strip of paper behind the plate read, Thomas and Eleanor Bell, Philadelphia, October 1918. Her grandparents. Ruby closed the case before her breath could cloud the glass. The tin box resisted at first. Its clasp had rusted along one corner, and she worked it loose with a drop of lamp oil and the thin blade of the hand scraper. Inside were 4 cloth rolls, a sealed envelope, and a small blue pouch. The first roll held $20 gold pieces, each wrapped in tissue. The second contained $10 eagles. The third held silver dollars, mostly Morgan coins, heavy enough to pull the fabric straight when lifted. The fourth contained half eagles and several worn Liberty Head quarter eagles. Ruby carried the rolls to the front counter, closed the door, and counted under the ruby glass lamp because its low red light felt less exposing than daylight. She counted once, then again. $48,167.50. The odd amount troubled her until she found 3 additional half-dollars caught in a torn seam of the final roll. She wrote each denomination in the back of the repair manual, adding columns with the blunt pencil Mr. Brunner had said she could not afford. The blue pouch held no money. Inside lay a World War I victory medal with 5 campaign clasps and a narrow ribbon faded toward gray. The edge bore the engraved name Thomas A. Bell and the year 1919. Beside it rested a silver watch key and 1 human tooth wrapped in paper. Ruby did not unwrap the tooth. The envelope remained sealed. Its paper had browned, but the wax carried a clear impression of a camera lens surrounded by walnut leaves. Across the front, in handwriting she recognized from labels inside Elias's old tool chest, were 4 words, "For the one who stays." Ruby placed the money back in the tin box. She returned the copper plates to their compartment and carried only the portrait medal and letter outside. The creek had lowered after the rain. It moved between stones with a dark copper shine reflecting one strip of evening sky. Ruby sat on the bank until the studio windows disappeared behind her and the cold reached through her coat. She did not read the letter. She held the closed portrait case in both hands and watched the water travel past what could not travel with it. Some places do not ask to be saved, they ask to be remembered. At first light, Ruby carried the envelope to the polishing bench and set the portrait beside it. The wax broke beneath the edge of Elias's agate burnisher. Inside were 5 pages folded twice their blue-black writing, thin but steady. Ruby recognized the hand from labels on the hidden tools, and from one birthday card Elias had kept beneath his shaving mirror. "My dear one, whoever you are. If you have opened the silvering box, then you have already shown more patience than most people who entered this room. Do not hurry now. Some things become visible only when the angle is right. My name is Eleanor Maybell. Dr. Samuel G. Hart of Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia has told me that the weakness in my hands and the pressure behind my eyes are caused by an inoperable brain tumor. He believes I have months, not years. I am writing while my right hand still obeys me. Our line in this work began with Josiah Bell, born in Lancaster in 1829, who ground optical glass and opened this studio in Philadelphia in 1857. His daughter, Miriam Bell, born here in 1861, learned plate polishing before women were commonly permitted behind a camera. Miriam's son, Thomas Bell, born in 1889, became my husband and carried these instruments through the years before the Great War. Our son Elias, born in 1921, learned the trade from me after his father died from wounds received in the Meuse-Argonne campaign. If Elias has children and they have children, then perhaps these pages have reached a hand I will never know. The studio closed on November 14, 1936. Business had faded, chemicals had become difficult to obtain, and grief had kept this family silent for more than 30 years. Silence can preserve an object. It can also ruin a house. If you intend to make the plate, polish the silver with rotten stone and olive oil until no straight scratch remains. Sensitize above iodine until the surface turns pale yellow, usually 45 to 60 seconds in cool weather. If bromine is used, keep the ratio near 1 part bromine water to 8 parts distilled water and never breathe above the tray. Warm the mercury bath to approximately 167 degrees Fahrenheit and watch the image rise for no longer than 7 minutes. Exactness is not coldness. Exactness is care. The coins were earned here, one portrait at a time, then hidden when banks failed and men came asking questions that did not concern them. Use only what keeps the roof above the work. Inheritance is not the money. It is the bench repaired before winter, the plate cleaned after use, and the knowledge passed without making the next pair of hands feel small. The portrait is Thomas and me before the influenza year. Behind the studio near the creek, you will find a low fieldstone marker beneath the leaning walnut. His name is there, though his body rests elsewhere. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Eleanor Maybell, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, June 6, 1943. Ruby read the letter once without moving and a second time with her forefinger beneath each line. Then she folded the pages along Eleanor's original creases, matching every worn edge, and returned them to the envelope. Her hands remained flat upon it until the morning light reached the far end of the bench. She went through the back door carrying the portrait. The leaning walnut stood beyond the outhouse where roots had lifted the ground into hard ridges. Ruby cleared chickweed and damp leaves with the scraper. Beneath them lay a fieldstone no higher than her ankle, its face nearly erased by lichen. Water from the creek had darkened one side. Thomas A. Bell, 1889, 1916, husband, father, plate maker. Ruby placed the portrait against the stone. In the silver image, Thomas still wore his uncreased collar, untouched by France fever or the silence that followed him home. Back inside, she filled Elias's spirit lamp with the little kerosene remaining in a brown bottle. The wick had stiffened, so she trimmed it with the blade from her sewing kit. Her match scraped twice before catching. A small blue flame settled beneath the brass cap reflected in the agate burnisher and the black lens of the old camera. The room did not change all at once. It changed by inches. Mrs. Vale had kept one worn dollar beneath the glass of her desk. Amos Reed had pointed with his rake and warned her about the walnut without asking why she had come. Mr. Brunner had opened a ledger when 38 cents would not buy a pencil. Even the bus driver, seeing her broken suitcase, had waited while she tied it shut before pulling away. No one had rescued her. Each had simply refused to make the road harder. Before we go further, tell us in the comments about one small kindness someone once gave you when they did not have to. It may have been a meal, a ride, a patient word, or a door held open at the right moment. Sometimes the smallest thing is what allows a person to take the next step. That night, Ruby placed the portrait case, the folded letter, and Elias's agate burnisher beside her coat on the floor. The spirit lamp had gone dark, but its brass was still warm when she touched it. She slept with 4 generations within reach. The first snow arrived on December 2nd and measured 4½ inches against the north wall. Ruby watched meltwater drip through the broken rear roof into 3 pans, then read the roofing chapter of Mr. Brunner's manual 3 times before climbing the attic ladder. The damaged plane measured 28 feet by 19. Allowing for overlap and waste, she calculated 21 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 14 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Mr. Brunner extended the credit without comment and brought out a roofing hatchet with a worn leather grip. "It belonged to my brother," he said. "He would dislike it resting." The skilled hands belonged to Walter Peel, a 71-year-old former roofer whose right shoulder sat lower than his left. He arrived carrying a chalk box and refused the coins Ruby offered. "You can pay by listening." They cut away the softened decking, sistered the split rafter with 2 soundboards, and tightened the joint using carriage bolts rather than trusting the old nails. Walter snapped a blue chalk line across the first course. He taught Ruby to set each nail in 3 strokes, 1 to start, 1 to drive, 1 light tap to seat it without crushing the cedar. On the 4th morning, he touched a raised nail with the hatchet head, That nail's proud. Ruby reached for the hammer. Pull it. They worked 11 days through frost-weak sunlight and one afternoon of freezing rain. Ruby learned to keep her knees below the ridge and her tools tied to a sash cord. By December 14, the final shingle lay beneath the chimney flashing. That evening, snow crossed the roof without entering the studio. January exposed what soot had hidden. Several bricks above the smoke chamber had spalled until their faces could be removed with a thumbnail. Mortar fell as pale powder whenever Ruby touched the joints. She carried each damaged brick to the bench, measured it, and found replacements from a dismantled wall behind Brunner's shed. For the repair mortar, Walter recommended 2 parts hydraulic lime to 1 part washed sand with a small addition of fire clay near the flue where heat was strongest. Ruby mixed only enough for 30 minutes of work, dampened each old joint before pointing it, and pressed the mortar deep with a narrow iron. For 3 weeks, daytime temperatures remained in the 20s. She worked barehanded because gloves dulled her sense of the joints, but every 15 minutes her fingers went numb. She climbed down, held them near the spirit lamp, then returned before the mortar skinned over. The chimney cap required 2 new bricks and a sloped lime crown. Inside, she replaced the loose throat stone and sealed a hairline opening where smoke had entered the attic. On January 27, Ruby built a test fire from dry walnut and a strip of newspaper. She warmed the flue with a small flame first, then added 2 split logs. Smoke rose without hesitation. Outside, a narrow gray column lifted cleanly above the roof and bent east in the wind. Ruby stood in the yard until the last trace vanished. Beneath dirt and wax, the front room floor was white pine fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. Several heads stood high enough to tear sandpaper, so Ruby drove them below the surface with a nail set before renting Mr. Brunner's random orbit sander for $14 a day. The first pass used 80 grit paper and removed the dark crust without flattening the old tool marks. The second at 120 softened the scratches. The final pass at 220 left the board smooth beneath her palm, but not new. Ruby worked with the grain near the walls and vacuumed between every grit so loose particles would not cut circles into the wood. She brushed on 3 thin coats of oil, wiping away every glossy pool after 20 minutes. Each coat deepened the pine from dull brown to dark honey, then toward mahogany, where years of foot traffic had compressed the grain. The final coat required 48 hours without shoes, tools, or stove ash. One morning, Ruby carried the sander to the doorway and could not make herself lift it. She walked instead to the marsh beyond the creek. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, its long body held perfectly still while wind moved the reeds around it. Ruby sat on a cold stone until afternoon and watched the bird take only 7 steps. She did no work that day. The next morning she returned before sunrise, lifted the sander, and completed the final room without rushing. The studio had 8 windows. 3 held no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. The last contained 1 original pane dated 1788 in the old records, wavering with trapped bubbles and a faint green cast. Ruby removed that sash first and stored it upright between folded blankets while the others were repaired. She stripped the remaining putty with a warmed knife, careful not to cut into the wooden rabbets. After setting each replacement pane on a thin bed of DP33 glazing putty, she pressed glazier's points into the sash with the flat side of a chisel. The final putty line was drawn in one deliberate stroke, its bevel angled to shed rain without appearing from inside the room. The sash cords had rotted into gray threads. Ruby replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, lowered each counterweight into its pocket, and secured the cord with a figure-8 knot large enough to hold without splitting the old wood. For the preserved pane, she used no power tool. She cleaned the glass with distilled water and a soft cloth, reset it by hand, and left every bubble exactly where time had placed it. On the afternoon of February 8th, she raised the last repaired sash. It moved smoothly, balanced by the hidden weight. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch level with the window. Its claws closed around the wet bark. Ruby remained still until the bird tilted its black-capped head toward the light, then flew across the creek. She lowered the sash and heard the meeting rails settle together without a rattle. The plaster near the chimney failed 3 times. The original walls were horsehair plaster laid over hand-split oak lath, and each new patch cracked where old lime met hard modern compound. Ruby scraped the repairs away before they could pretend to hold. Mr. Brunner found an old burlap bag of clean horsehair in his loft and brought it folded beneath his coat. She mixed lime putty with sharp sand, worked in the hair by hand, and pressed a scored scratch coat through the lath until it curled behind the wood. Over that went a 3/8-inch brown coat, leveled but left slightly rough, then allowed to cure for 72 hours beneath damp cloth. The finished coat was 1/8 inch thin enough to follow the old wall's unevenness instead of hiding it. When the final surface had begun to firm, Ruby passed a wet brush across the seam and could no longer find where the damage ended. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Dorsey began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before sunrise. She was a square-shouldered woman with flour always caught in one eyebrow, and every bag held something that could be warmed over the fire: bean soup, 2 biscuits, an end piece of ham, or apples baked until their skins opened. Ruby carried payment to the cafe after the fourth delivery. Doris pushed the coins back across the counter with one red knuckle. In candles when the shop reopens. Ruby had not said the studio would reopen. Doris turned toward the grill before the question could be asked. Caleb Reed came the next Saturday on a blue Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul laid across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a fence rail with a cowlick that refused his cap. Without entering the studio, he split the storm-fallen walnut limb into stove lengths and stacked them beneath the eaves with the bark facing outward. Ruby offered him 50 cents. He shook his head and rubbed a blister along his thumb. My mother said, "About your grandfather." Then he mounted the bicycle and rode away before Ruby could decide whether he meant something Elias had done or something he had failed to finish. Reverend Boyd passed each morning at 7. He wore a brown coat polished smooth at the elbows and carried no Bible, only a walking stick cut from applewood. At the gate, he tipped his hat, looked once toward the roof, and said the same four-word prayer. Keep her hands steady. He never stopped long enough to require an answer. Their help accumulated quietly. A bag on a step, split wood beneath an eave, 4 words released into cold air. By March, the studio contained more evidence of kindness than furniture. Ruby postponed the cellar until February 11. The door opened beneath the rear stairs and descended by 7 granite steps into a room 12 feet wide and 15 feet long. Its fieldstone floor had been laid dry, each stone fitted closely enough that only pale threads of sand showed between them. The air smelled of earth iron and old apples. At the center lay a dressed granite slab unlike the surrounding stones. A carved mark crossed its face, a round camera lens enclosed by 4 walnut leaves, the same symbol pressed into Eleanor's sealing wax. Ruby swept the slab, traced its edge, and left it where it was. Some doors became less trustworthy when forced. Under the 3rd step, her fingers touched oak. The box had been wedged behind a loose stone and measured no longer than her hand. Inside rested a brass key whose bow had been shaped into the lens and walnut emblem. Beneath it lay a tintype wrapped in linen. The image showed a young woman standing outside the studio in the summer of 1903. She held an agate burnisher against one hip. Her hair was pinned differently, her dress reached the ground, and yet the face was Ruby's face, with 25 years of certainty added to it. On the back, scratched into the blackened iron, were the words, "Miriam Bell, daughter of Josiah Bell, age 25, summer of 1903. Ruby carried the key and tintype upstairs. She placed the portrait beside Eleanor and Thomas, then hung the key from a square nail above the mantel. She did not know what had opened. By March, the snow withdrew in gray shelves along the road. The creak grew loud enough to be heard through closed windows, and the walnut trees loosened green catkins that tapped against the glass. Ruby cleaned one copper plate and stopped. She would not begin the full craft that spring. The iodine box needed repair, the mercury bath required safer ventilation, and knowledge read in a notebook was not yet knowledge carried by the hands. She chose one worn silver dollar from the cash and spent only part of it on scrap copper polishing powder and thin silver sheet for small tests. Each afternoon she practiced on pieces no larger than a matchbox. She learned how pressure changed the reflection, how a hidden scratch returned beneath polish, and how impatience could be seen long after the hand had left. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Ruby completed her first true daguerreotype. The plate had taken 11 attempts. On the 12th morning, she polished the silver until the window frame appeared without distortion. Sensitized it above iodine to a pale straw color, exposed it beneath the north light, and developed it in the restored mercury box while the thermometer held near 167 degrees. The subject was not a person. She photographed Elias's brass polishing stick laid across the open chemistry notebook with one walnut leaf beside it. When the image rose from the plate, every scratch in the brass remained visible. Ruby fixed it, washed it, and sealed it beneath glass in a simple leather case. She did not correct the marks. The studio now held white pine floors darkened by oil lime walls that followed the old framing balanced windows, and a roof that answered rain with an even hush. The mahogany camera stood on its original rail. Brown chemical bottles occupied a locked cabinet. Above the mantel hung the brass key, still waiting. That winter, Caleb came to split wood and leaned his maul against the walnut tree. A narrow brass plate had become visible where bark had grown around its edges. Ruby cleared moss from the screws and saw the lens and walnut marks stamped at its center. The key from the cellar entered without resistance. Inside the tree was a cavity lined with sheet copper. Ruby removed a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. It contained a folded 48-star American flag small enough to have rested across a coffin, and a note written by Miriam Bell on October 6, 1918, while Thomas served with the American Expeditionary Forces during the First World War. She had written that the flag was for the son who came home, or for the tree if he did not. She asked that no one display it for pride. It was to be kept near honest work where sacrifice would not become decoration. Thomas returned wounded and died the following year. Ruby refolded the flag along its old creases. She placed it in a walnut box beneath the portrait of Thomas and Eleanor, then returned Miriam's note to the copper-lined hollow. The brass plate closed flush against the bark. On November 11, 2025, Ruby carried Thomas's victory medal to Laurel Hill Cemetery. At 11 in the morning, while bells marked the anniversary of the armistice, she laid it beside the family marker named in county military records. There was no speech and no crowd. Reverend Boyd stood at a distance with his hat removed. Of the money hidden in the fuming box, Ruby used 4 coins. One paid for the first silver sheet. One bought the vent pipe that made mercury development safer. One covered replacement glass for the north window. The fourth purchased archival paper wax in a tin box. Everything else remained counted, wrapped and sealed beneath the false cedar floor. Ruby added a note to the ledger specifying that the cash belonged to the building's care, not to whoever happened to hold the deed. Across the envelope she wrote, "For the next one." The studio reopened without a sign in the newspaper. Doris pinned an index card to the corkboard inside the cafe. Ruby Bell daguerreotype portraits by appointment, one sitting each Saturday. By spring, the mailing list held 43 names. Ruby accepted only 4 appointments a month. She charged enough for chemicals, plates, coal, and repairs. If someone could not pay, she asked them to bring a useful object and tell the truth about why it mattered. A railroad worker brought his father's watch. A widow brought a sewing thimble. A schoolteacher brought the key to a classroom demolished decades before. Ruby photographed each object with the same care. She gave a face. Caleb returned one April afternoon carrying a cedar board beneath his arm. He had grown broad through the shoulders, though the same cowlick escaped beneath his cap. The board had been carved by hand, the letters deep and slightly uneven. Bell daguerreotype studio and daughters. Ruby read it twice. "There are no daughters," she said. Caleb set the sign against the wall. "Not yet." He meant no promise of marriage or blood. The words belonged to Miriam, Eleanor, Ruby, and any woman who might one day enter with steady hands and no permission from anyone. They hung the sign beneath the north window. That evening, Ruby opened the tin box she had purchased with the 4th coin. She placed archival paper on the workbench, sharpened a pencil, and began a letter. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the roof measurements, the safe handling of iodine, the danger of mercury vapor, and the exact place where the chimney mortar tended to fail. She named Doris, Caleb, Mr. Brunner, Mrs. Vale, Amos Sunday, and Reverend Boyd. She explained that the work should be practiced first on small plates and that no hidden money could make an untrained hand careful. Then she wrote that loneliness was not proof of being unloved. Sometimes it was only the empty interval before kindness arrived in a form too modest to announce itself. She folded the pages twice. Some places do not ask to be saved, they ask to be remembered. Ruby sealed the letter with the lens and walnut mark and placed it beside Eleanor's original message inside the silvering box. Outside, evening settled over the creek. The restored windows caught the last narrow light and the sign moved once in the wind before becoming still. The daguerreotype studio waits. It has always waited. Years later, when Mrs. Vale retired, the county workers emptied her desk. Beneath its glass top, they found an $11 deed receipt and one worn dollar bill pressed flat beside Ruby Bell's name. The new clerk left the bill where it was.